Hi guys, hope you're all well and staying safe and staying put as much as you can right now. As promised, I am shooting a video covering the material in Chapter 6. And by way of housekeeping, before we get started, I wanted to note that I am greatly enjoying reading the discussions that y'all are having over on D2L. And I appreciate y'all chiming in with that. If you haven't done so yet, please, when you can, take a moment, go to D2L, look under the discussion board for our online remote class, and participate in those discussions as much as humanly possible during this time. So I got the midterms graded. The grades have been posted online. They are also under grades on D2L. So if you want to check out how you did on your midterm, on the whole, y'all did a really great job on the midterm. It really showed that you studied and that you had taken good notes during our face-to-face courses. I encourage you to continue to do that during these video lectures. Additionally, there's a PowerPoint that corresponds with each chapter, and the PowerPoint for Chapter 6 is available under PowerPoints on D2L. So you might want to download that and take a look at that because it's going to closely correspond with the material that I'm going to cover today in this video. So, ironically enough, we are moving into Part 3, which discusses interpersonal processes. And the first thing that we're going to talk about, again, ironically enough, is perceiving and interpreting social worlds, which is kind of amusing when you think about the fact that right now we are discouraging people from being social. But so we are going to talk about our perception and interpretation of social worlds. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is something that we've already started discussing over on the discussion boards, is the concept of mindfulness. Mindfulness is the state of alert and lively awareness. It is the active processing of information and the creation of new categories. And as we've been discussing on the discussion board for this week, we're all finding new ways to practice mindfulness under the circumstances. I believe one of you mentioned that you're still working in a restaurant, and so you're really becoming more mindful of practices in terms of cleaning and sanitizing the restaurant and the facilities in between takeout orders. So I was gratified to hear that. But again, mindfulness is a state of alert and lively awareness. It is the active processing of information and the creation of new categories. And it is the exact opposite of something which we refer to as mindlessness, which is something we are all guilty of engaging in, myself included. And that mindlessness is the tendency to interpret social interaction in a habitual manner. And in mindlessness, we rely on our prior social and cognitive categorizations to make sense of the world. So right now we're all, while we're engaging in new ways to be mindful under the circumstances, we're also all engaging in a little bit of mindlessness as well. Mindlessness is something that you might do, as you're watching television or binging Netflix right now. But again, I would urge you to also think of ways in which you are practicing mindfulness. So that's the distinction between mindfulness and mindlessness, which is something that you will obviously probably see on our final, and something to just think about in general. Now, when we think about how we perceive the world, there are three factors that affect how we perceive the world, or affect our general perception of the world. And the first one is something that, we're all experiencing all of the time, and that is emotion. And whether we're experiencing positive emotions or negative emotions, again, we're all experiencing emotion every moment of every day. And in thinking about emotion, we look at something that we refer to as the mood congruity hypothesis. And in the mood congruity hypothesis, we hypothesize that memories are more easily retrieved when there is a match between our emotional state at the time that we're creating the original memory or we're forming the original memory, and when we go back and retrieve that memory. So, when we align our emotional state at the time of creating a specific memory, it becomes easier for us to go back and retrieve that memory and to retrieve the emotion that we were feeling during that time. Again, that's referred to as the mood congruity hypothesis. The second factor that's going to affect our perception of the world is our motivation. And everybody is motivated by similar factors, you know, our need for food and shelter and love and companionship, and we're also motivated by dissimilar factors. And in thinking about motivation, we consider what we call automotives. These are motivations that operate outside of our conscious awareness. And in automotives, if a motivation is primed in one particular context, it can be easily transferred and carried over to other motivations. Now, conscious motivations also will affect our perception of the world in general. So the second factor that's going to affect our perception of the world is motivation. And while we all share some motivations, we also are motivated by different factors. For example, you know, everyone in this course is motivated by the degree or desire to earn a degree so that you can get a better job, right? We've talked about that before in class. So the second factor that's going to affect our perception of the world is motivation. The third factor that's going to affect our perception of the world is what we refer to as cognitive structures. Cognitive structures, and there are more than one of these. With cognitive structures, we consider what we call schemata. And schematas are cognitive structures that we use to make sense of the world. And, you know, there are conscious schemata and unconscious schemata, but just like we all are, you know, constantly experiencing emotions, and we are all, you know, motivated by different factors. We're all experiencing different schemata that we utilize to make sense of the world and how we fit into it. This is particularly true during this time. Now, with cognitive structures, we consider something we call the principle of least effort. And in the principle of least effort, we examine the tendency to rely on our pre-existing concepts of how the world operates rather than the specific details from the current situation that we're in. So again, the principle of least effort is the tendency to rely on pre-existing concepts, pre-existing experiences and perspectives rather than addressing the specific details of the current situation. So the three factors that are going to affect perception, again, motivation, emotion, and cognitive structures. With cognitive structures, we need to consider something that we refer to as social cognition. And social cognition simply is the process of using cognitive structures. And social cognition is important because it affects our interpretation of meaning. It guides our interactions and our actions in a given situation. With social cognition, we are constantly examining the appropriateness of specific cognitions and how it can help us to gain control over the social situations that we might find ourselves in. And also in social cognition, we're going to use communication, much like we do in life in general, to create those social cognitions. So social cognition, again, is the process of using cognitive structures. It is relevant and important because it affects our interpretation of meaning. It guides our actions in a given situation or interaction. It helps us to examine the appropriateness of the cognition and to help us gain control of social situations. And we use communication to create these social cognitions. With schemata, we're going to examine a number of different processes, and we're asked to think about those processes in different ways. With schemata, we have what we refer to as a prototype. And this might be a word that you are already familiar with, that you've heard before. A prototype simply is an abstract representation of what is typical about members of a class. For example, a class such as yourself. What is typical of the members of this class? Well, many of you live in Westmoreland County. Most of you, have full or part-time jobs that you're balancing along with your studies. Again, these are somewhat abstract concepts in that they can apply to individuals in general. We also have, with schematic thinking, something that we refer to as the exemplar. And exemplars are images of actual objects, people, or events that we have encountered in the past. And exemplars are very similar to symbols that we have talked about before, in that, exemplars can be used to symbolize specific objects, people, or events that, we have experienced or encountered previously, and that we bring to the given situation. So it touches on sort of our prior knowledge and our prior experiences. Now, we use schemata to describe and classify people in social situations. And there are a number of ways in which we use schemata to classify and describe specific people, both in an abstract way and in a more specific way. Now, we utilize what we refer to as the personal construct in order to describe people in detail. So personal constructs are simply characteristics about people that we use to describe people in detail. We also use what we refer to as a person prototype, and these are mental categories that we use to classify or label specific groups of people. Now, one of the other things that we talked about on the discussion board so far, in fact, this was in last week's prompt, was the concept of stereotypes. And I've really found it fascinating to read about the various ways in which you have encountered stereotypes. And you really made me think about, stereotypes that I hadn't considered before. And, again, I'm individually responding to that over on the discussion board. And a stereotype simply is a cluster of expectations about the probable behavior of a group member. And, stereotypes can be very general, or they could be more specific. And as we, are discussing over on the discussion board, we all have encountered various stereotypes. We all fall under various stereotypes, and we all hold stereotypes, both positive and negative, about other groups of people. Now, in general, we should avoid stereotyping people because a lot of misinformation about specific groups can result from that. For example, in the time of the coronavirus, a lot of people are, have the stereotype that, all Asian people have the coronavirus. And as I mentioned in the other video, that's obviously not the case. And that's a very hurtful stereotype. And, Asian people are experiencing increased violence and hostility because that stereotype has been, perpetuated. So, there are obvious stereotypes that we don't want to perpetuate about specific groups of people because it could be harmful to those groups of people. But there are other stereotypes that are somewhat more benign. And again, we all hold certain stereotypes. Just speaking personally, people who wear glasses are considered to be smart. Is that necessarily true? Obviously not. But that's a stereotype that many of us hold, and we tend to respect information that's delivered to people or delivered by people who are wearing glasses, because we have that, old stereotype that we've held since childhood that, people who wear glasses are smart. Again, obviously not always true. So again, these are some schemata that we use to describe and classify people: the personal construct, the characteristics we use to describe people in detail; person prototypes, the mental categories to which we assign others, to which we put people into specific classifications or labels that we give them as part of the person prototype. And then there's the stereotype, which is simply the cluster of expectations about the probable behavior of group members. And stereotypes can be positive and they can be negative. They can be harmful or they can be beneficial. There's also schemata that we use to define our roles as individuals and our roles in relationships, all types of relationships, whether the relationships we have with our families, which are probably a lot closer relationships right now, or the relationships that, maybe we have with a significant other, which also at this time might be a lot closer than we're used to. But there is schemata that we use to define how we fit into the world, the roles that we play, and how we fit into our specific relationships. And the first schemata we're going to look at is what's called the role schemata. And the role schemata represents the rules, the norms, and the behaviors that we all play in our various roles. And these are the norms that are going to guide those roles that each of us play. Those are the norms that are going to guide those roles. Those are the behaviors that we're going to exhibit in those roles. I'm a teacher, and so you expect me to teach, and that is just simply a role schemata that I fit into. Your students, and so we expect you to be studious. We expect you to study. We expect you to read your text. We expect you to answer questions. We expect you to participate in thought-provoking discussions. These are norms. These are rules. These are behaviors that we expect of each other. Role schemata, representing the rules, norms, and behaviors that we expect from various roles. Relational schemata, on the other hand, represents the patterns of interaction that we, as we interact with each other in a given situation. So relational schemata, a second type of schemata that will help us to define roles and relationships, simply represents the patterns of interaction as we all interact with each other. So that's two types of schemata that define roles and relationships: role schemata and relational schemata. Now, as individuals, we are guided by schemata that we refer to as self-schemata. And self-schemata includes our cognitive representations of ourselves as individuals. And self-schemata is going to be very specific to the individual. And self-schemata is going to include our aspirations. Everybody in our classroom, wherever you're watching this from right now, you have different aspirations. Some of you want to go into the healthcare field, and thank you for that. Some of you want to go into business. Some of you are more artistic and you want to go into the arts. So we all have various aspirations. We all have different values. This is also part of self-schemata. Our values come from our families, they come from our experiences, they're guided, many times from our communities of faith. And they are dependent on the individual cultures from which we all originate. So values are guided by that, and they, again, just like our aspirations, are very specific to the individual. Now, do many of us share the same aspirations? Do many of us share the same values? Absolutely. Self-schemata is also going to include our various attributes, and that's not just our physical attributes, but our mental attributes, our emotional attributes. We've talked before about, how we behave when we're angry, and some of us are very quick to anger, and we get loud, and, there's an explosion, and then others of us are more of a slow burn, and we tend to get quiet. And as I have told you before in class, my daughter knows that, if I got loud, that everything would be okay in a matter of moments, but when she really needed to worry was when I got quiet. And then that hasn't really changed. Another thing to consider in terms of our cognitive representations of ourselves, in terms of self-schemata, is that we all have individual preferences. Some of us like vanilla ice cream, some of us like chocolate ice cream, some of us like strawberry ice cream, and then there are those of us that like all three, and so we get Neapolitan ice cream. That's a very generic example of a preference, but we all have individual preferences. Sometimes those preferences have to be set aside. For example, all of you signed up for a face-to-face class, and because perhaps you didn't want to take an online class, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But under the circumstances, you've had to set that preference aside. Speaking of things that we've had to set aside, we've had to alter, and have had to evolve rather quickly, another self-schemata that we want to consider is the idea of routines. And we all have a routine that we follow to some degree. Now, perhaps your routine has been greatly disrupted during this time, and perhaps your routine has changed dramatically as, maybe you're working more hours, or maybe you're not working at all, or, you're not having that routine of driving to class and going to class and getting to interact with your fellow students. Or maybe your routine has been disrupted by the presence of your children at home. One thing that I would say about routines that's relevant to our current time and our current circumstances is that I think now more than ever it's important to preserve some form of routine, and this is something that I've struggled with. Making myself get up at a specific time when I don't necessarily have to be somewhere. Like, for example, this morning, I got up at 8 o'clock. Now, I've told you before, I'm not a morning person. But, I woke up, the sun was up, I looked up at the clock, I saw it's 8 o'clock, I'm like, get up, have some coffee, get dressed, get prepared for the day like you would any other day. Now, have there been some changes to my daily routine? Absolutely. But to some degree, I'm trying to preserve as much of my original routine as possible. It brings me comfort, and I think that it might bring y'all comfort as well. So to the degree that you can follow your normal routine, or that you can set, a routine that works for you during this time, I think that is really helpful. On the subject of self-schemata, we all have different routines, and right now I think it's really important to focus on that routine and to continue to follow it. In terms of schemata, we also have various schemata that we encounter in our social situations. Now, I know right now we're not involved in a lot of social situations, so maybe this is material that you can kind of file for later when we're all allowed to get back out into the outside world. Now, the schemata that we need to consider in terms of social situation, the first one we want to look at is what we call event schemata. And these represent our expectations about specific social situations. For example, in our class, you expect that you're going to come into the classroom. Obviously, this has been disrupted for now, but you're going to come into the classroom, you're going to get your paper and pen or your electronic device out. You're going to prepare to listen to the instructor lecture. You're going to prepare to perhaps see a visual on the board, or to see a PowerPoint, and you're going to take notes on that material. Now, that's going to vary according to what class you're in, and that's really more representative of our class. And I know that, not all of your classes are necessarily going to be like that, but that's something that you have come to expect from the social situation that is our course. And this, is applicable not just to the classroom, but to all social situations, whether it's something which is a little bit more rare right now, but such as, going to the grocery store. Well, you're going to, certain things are going to happen during that event. You're going to get your buggy. You're going to, maybe look at your grocery list as you retrieve items from the shelves. When you gather all of the items that you need, that you plan to buy, and maybe some that you didn't plan to buy, you're going to go up to the checkout, and you're either going to self-checkout, which is increasingly more popular, or you're going to interact with someone that's going to be at the checkout counter. And as I mentioned, and now more than ever, it's really important to be courteous to people in that situation. So that's something that I did want to bring up as we talk about expectations about social situations. Some of those expectations have evolved and changed in light of our current circumstances. And so while I always encourage you to be courteous in a social situation and to think about, to put yourself in the other person's shoes, it's really more important now more than ever to do that. So we have specific expectations about social situations. if you go to the doctor, and hopefully this will not be something that you'll have to do in the near future, because you'll continue to stay safe and stay well. Although I have seen on the discussion board that some of you have reported that you're not feeling well, and certainly my thoughts are with you, and I hope that you get well soon. You go to the doctor, you check in. You sit in the waiting room for a little while, depending on which, if it's a specialist or your general practitioner, your mileage may vary as to how long you're going to sit in that waiting room. And then, someone is going to, open the door, they're going to call you back, they're going to, maybe do the dreaded weigh-in. I personally hate that, but it's part of the doctor's visit, and I expect it because it's an event schemata. So, they're going to check your blood pressure, and then they're going to, once they get you into the examining room, they're going to ask you questions about what brings you to the doctor. They're going to ask you questions about, what medications you might be taking, and then they're going to say, okay, wait a moment, the doctor will be with you. And then, of course, again, your mileage may vary as to how long you have to wait, but then the doctor's going to come in, and the doctor's going to ask you questions about your health, and the doctor's going to examine you, and that could include, any number of processes. And, then, the doctor may order a shot, or, they may order a prescription, and they're going to enter all of that in this day and age, usually into a computer. And, this is something that you expect. You expect this process to occur when you go to the doctor. So that's another example of an event schemata. And there's a lot more that we could look at, but in the interest of brevity, we'll move on. Now, in social situations, although we are not all actors in the literal sense, we are all actors in the figurative sense, and we're, playing a role, and as actors, we have scripts. And scripts are simply guides to how we are going to behave in a given situation. And we're going to follow those scripts in those interactions during those event schemata, during those social situations in which we're going to manage our expectations about how events are going to unfold. So we're going to use scripts just like actors would, on a movie set or on a stage. We're going to use scripts to guide our actions and to guide our interactions, and to, act as a guide to how we communicate with each other in a given social situation. Now, in social situations, we're going to have what we refer to as social episodes. And during those social episodes, we are going to represent our expectations for common, recurring interaction routines within our culture. And, our culture as Americans is going to differ from, say, the culture of, people in Asia, or people in Europe, or people in Australia, or I could keep going with this, but you get my point. So each culture is going to have different expectations for those recurring routines, for those recurring interactions that are common, that are general. And these are simply referred to as social episodes. These are the schemata that we are going to apply to social situations. So in thinking about sizing up a given situation, which is something that we do in all of our interactions, first we want to identify the episode in which we are currently interacting. And we're going to use social episodes, that schemata that we just talked about, in sizing up a given situation. We talked about scripts, and being more specific in terms of scripts, there are three kinds of scripts. There are closed episode scripts that are almost completely scripted. That is, that before the interaction, we know exactly what's going to happen during a given interaction. Closed episode scripts. There are open episode scripts. These are situations in which we go in without a plan, or with a very general plan. And this is going to encompass a lot of the communication that we do on a daily basis. They're going to be open episodes. Our interactions, we may have a general plan, but we don't know exactly how events are going to unfold, so we're going to have to kind of roll with the punches. This is referred to as the open episode. And then we have what is referred to as the third script, a defined episode. And this is an open episode in which the participants have an end goal and they want to negotiate some sense of closure. So three kinds of scripts: closed episode, almost completely scripted. Open episodes are going to be more spontaneous. We're not going to have a plan, or we're going to have a very general plan that's going to guide our interaction during an open episode. And the defined episode, in which we have a desired end result, some sense of closure for the participants that are involved. Now, in sizing up situations, we also deal with what we refer to as invisible situational constraints. And invisible situation constraints are going to include multiple activities. So a lot of the activities that we participate in on a daily basis are subject to invisible situational constraints. These are going to affect the difficulty of the tasks that we perform on a regular basis. And invisible situational constraints often are going to involve other people who are going to play a role in the level of constraint that is placed on the task at hand or the activity in which we are currently engaged. Invisible situational constraints involve multiple activities, difficult tasks, and the involvement of others. Now, just as we size up situations, we also size up people. And our perception of people is going to be guided, or are going to be guided by a number of factors. We're going to use personal constructs to judge others. We're going to use personal constructs based on the physicality of the people that we're interacting with, that is, their physical characteristics. And this doesn't just refer to their looks. This can also refer to, their physical nonverbal behaviors. We're going to use role constructs to judge others. Are people fitting into the roles? Are they acting according to the roles that we have assigned them? This is something that we're going to ask ourselves when we form our perception of another person. Are they playing their role correctly? Or are they playing their role incorrectly? Which is something else to consider in thinking about how we perceive other people and we perceive their credibility or their lack thereof. We're going to use our interaction, both the current interaction and past interactions that we've had with the individual when we form our perception of them. Have those interactions been positive? Have those interactions been negative? Have those interactions been sort of generic in nature? These are things that we're going to consider as we perform our perceptions of other people. We're going to look at our psychological constructs in terms of how we form other people. We're going to look at, some of the things we looked at, like emotion. What has been our prior psychological experience with someone? Has it been positive? Has it been negative? We're going to, what effect has that person played in terms of our own mental and even physical health? We're going to think about that in terms of psychology, and we're going to apply that to other individuals in terms of the personal construct. Something else to think about as we talk about how we perceive other people is what is referred to as implicit personality theory. An implicit personality theory is simply our perceptions of others' personalities based on the belief that certain traits are related to other traits or characteristics. And implicit personality theory comes into play when we think about forming stereotypes about other groups of people based on their traits and or their characteristics. For example, we might think of a person who is very talkative and very outgoing. We might say, well, that person is very confident and they're very assertive. When in fact, a person might just talk a lot to, sort of hide the fact that they're not confident. that they're not assertive, that they really are introverted in nature. So we have to be careful with some of the perceptions that we form based on other people's behavior because it can be misleading. On the other hand, people are generally speaking pretty accurate barometers of who they are as individuals. Their behavior is usually indicative of their personality most of the time. So in implicit personality theory, we think about an individual's central traits, such as mentioned, are they outgoing? Are they introverted? Are they more shy? Are they a happy person? Are they, more of an Eeyore, kind of a negative person to be around? Things like that. These are all central traits that we look at in forming implicit personality theory. And in implicit personality theory, we look at primacy versus recency and the effects thereof. So the primacy effects versus the recency effects. And what are primacy versus recency effects? Well, recency effects are, the perceptions we form of people based on our most recent interaction with them. Primacy effect is the perception we form of people based on our first impression. And, you've often heard it said that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And generally speaking, that's true, but it's actually more helpful, instead of forming your perceptions of people on your first impression of them, to kind of be more open-minded and to be more adaptable and to, sort of deal with people on a more recent individual level, as in, what have your interactions with that individual been like most recently, as opposed to what was your general first impression of a person, which can, often be based on one of those unfortunate stereotypes that we've talked about. Our perception of others is going to play a vital role in how we form our relationships, how we maintain our relationships. And in terms of evaluating our relationships, one of the things that we have to make sure that we are aware of is the concept of self-monitoring. And self-monitoring is an awareness of our images of ourself and our ability to adapt those images to the current situation. So we all have a preformed image of who we are as people, but just as I mentioned that it's not necessarily always most beneficial to form our impressions of other people based on our first impression, we also have to, as individuals, be adaptable and be willing to evolve our image of who we are as individuals based on the current situation in which we find ourselves. So self-monitoring is simply the awareness of images of ourselves and our ability to adapt those images to the current situation in which we find ourselves at the given time. Something else that we do as we form perceptions of other people and we figure out how we fit into the world in general is we make attributions. And there are a number of theories that determine how we attribute specific behaviors to specific individuals. And attribution theories simply are going to explain how we as humans infer the causes of social behavior. So how we infer, and that goes back to that concept that we talked about in class of implicit knowledge, how we're going to infer, why people behave the way that they do in given social situations. Now, there are different attributions that fall under attribution theories. And the first one we're going to look at is what we refer to as personality attributions. And these are simply, characteristics that we assign to people, roles that we assign to people based on their personalities. I hope that you haven't had the unfortunate experience of going to a medical provider whose, as we call it, bedside manner was less than warm and friendly. But I myself have been in that case, and You know, we tend to expect people who go into professions like healthcare, or my own profession, teaching, or you know, childcare. We tend to expect people to go into those professions because they genuinely like people and they genuinely want to help people. And so when we encounter people that are in those professions that are not very warm, very friendly, who don't seem to have the greater good of the person that they're treating or interacting with or teaching at heart, we question, you know, why those people chose to play those roles. Now, is that to say that because a person has a particular role that they're necessarily going to fall into the stereotype, or not stereotypes, but the attributes, the characteristics that we come to expect from that role? That's not necessarily always the case. But generally speaking, personality attributions are, you know, characteristics that we assign to people who choose to play specific roles based on their personality. Then there are attributions that we make based on the situation at hand. And those tend to be more flexible, and those tend to evolve more quickly than personality attributions. So two attribution theories: personality attributions versus situational attributions, and how we apply them based on versus the situation at hand versus a person's actual personality and the characteristics that make them up as individuals. We also bring certain attributional biases to each given situation and to the roles that we all play. And one thing that I want to talk about is what is referred to as the anchoring effect. And the anchoring effect is a judgment that we make. And not only is it a judgment that we make, but it is the final judgment that we make about the cause of another person's action, why they behave, why they do, or as they do in a given situation. And anchoring effects are almost always biased towards our initial point of view. So they're almost always going to be influenced by our first impression of the situation. This is referred to as the anchoring effect. The final judgment about the cause of another person's action is always, almost always going to be biased towards our initial point of view, our first impression of the situation, our initial perception of the situation. And some things that we do in terms of attributional biases is, you know, we overestimate people based on their personality. We underestimate the situations in which we find ourselves. And we insist on seeing every situation and interacting with each individual based on our own perspective only. Now, some of that is unavoidable and inevitable because, you know, whose perspective do we bring to the table in each given situation? Well, we're going to bring first and foremost our own perspective. But in order to be effective communicators, and in order for you know, us to interact in positive manners in social situations, it can also be helpful to sort of step back from our own perspective. And as I mentioned before, to put yourself in another person's shoes and to see the situation not from your perspective alone, but to try and see what their perspective might be on the given situation. In terms of social situations and how we think about them, and how we interpret them, and how we determine, you know, the effectiveness of those social situations, there are a number of things to consider. The first thing that I want to look at is what is referred to as naive realism. And naive realism is the belief that what we perceive, what we remember, is relatively complete and is a relatively accurate representation of the world. This is what is known as naive realism. Now, you might have been referred to as being naive on a given subject in the past, and it probably didn't make you feel very good because it was maybe not intended as a slight, but perhaps you perceived it as one, because no one wants to be thought of as being ignorant or being naive. But the fact of the matter is that we all practice naive realism. And we all have this perception that our own thoughts, that our own memories are relatively complete. They're relatively accurate representations of what's going on in the world. Another way in which we interpret each situation and our interactions with given individuals is what is referred to as the dual process models. Now, in the dual process models, we're going to harken back to this idea of mindfulness versus mindlessness. And in the dual process models, we're going to engage in both mindless and mindful ways. Just like in everyday life, we are going to engage in mindful practices and mindless practices, now more than ever. And in the dual process model, we look at, the attention that we pay to various events and situations. We look at how we identify what's going on in a given situation, or how we identify the emotions that someone might be feeling in a given interaction. We're going to place all of those interactions into specific categories, and those categories are going to be very subjective. That is, they're going to vary on an individual level. And in the dual process model, we are going to apply our own concepts of personalization to each encounter. And this is going to be based on, our schemata, our perceptions, our emotions, all of the things that we've talked about so far in this video. I've said before that it's important to maintain an open mind. And I want to talk briefly about the concept of open-mindedness versus closed-mindedness. In open-mindedness, people are open to new information. They're looking for creative solutions. And, as I've said more than once, even in this video, now more than ever, that is really crucial to maintain an open mind, to look for new information, to find creative solutions, and not just on a national level as we deal with this catastrophe, but in our daily lives. We're all being asked to make changes to how we to our routines and to how we complete certain processes. I appreciate y'all being so open-minded to the concept of online learning, since obviously that's what we are dealing with right now, and that's how we're having to deliver instruction. Now, open-mindedness is the exact opposite of closed-mindedness, as you might guess. And in closed-mindedness, people tend to think in traditional ways, and they tend to think of things as as they have always been. And they are not open to new information, and in fact, in some cases, they are outright hostile to receiving new information, and so they quarantine themselves from new ideas. And while it's important for us to quarantine our physical selves right now, we don't want to quarantine ourselves from new information. So this is really not a good time to practice closed-mindedness. But simply know that closed-mindedness is a personality trait in which people tend to think in traditional ways, and they tend to close themselves off, to isolate themselves from any new information that they might receive. So, in closing, as you develop new routines, as you think of new ways to practice mindfulness, which is the discussion prompt for this week, what are some ways in which we can increase our general mindfulness? Well, number one, we can recognize the extent to which our individual perceptions and behaviors are actually determined not by ourselves, but by society. We talked about the fact that communication is collective and that society governs communication. So the first way in which we can increase mindfulness is to recognize the extent to which our perceptions and behaviors are determined by society. The second way that we can increase our mindfulness is to recognize that we all have triggers, contextual triggers that govern our behavior. And you might have heard the word trigger used in a negative manner. But the fact of the matter is that we are all triggered by specific events, by specific emotions. I've used this example before in class. It's still the best one that I can think of. My mother cannot watch that ASPCA commercial where Sarah McLachlan is singing, you know, in the arms of an angel. She will leave the room. She will turn the television off. She cannot watch that commercial because she will be a wreck, an emotional wreck. She will just lose it. And we all know this. And so if we're in the room and that commercial comes on, we all know, grab the remote, you know, change the channel, turn the TV off, or say, Mom, get up and go in the other room if we're not willing to do that, because we know what's going to happen if my mother sees that commercial. And that's a trigger for her. And yeah, it's very sad. I'm not discounting the sadness of all those you know, puppies and kittens. I mean, it triggers me too, but not quite to the extent that it triggers my mother. A third way in which we can increase our mindfulness is to attach reason to our actions. And again, now more than ever, this is vitally important. Think about why we behave in the ways in which we behave. Ask yourself, before you exhibit a behavior, before you act, what is the logic behind my behavior? What is the reason? You know, even as you experience negative emotions, try to process them by thinking, okay, what reasons have led me to be in a negative frame of mind? The fourth way in which we can increase our mindfulness is simply to keep an open mind, look for new solutions, look for new perspectives, look for credible perspectives, look for solutions that work, otherwise they're really not solutions, but to be open-minded, look for those new solutions, and be open to new perspectives. This is the fourth way in which we can increase our mindfulness. And then finally, the fifth way in which we can increase mindfulness is to avoid censoring ourselves, to avoid jumping to conclusions, or what we refer to as premature cognitive commitments. Before you speak, think. You know, we've heard that general rule that if you're angry, you know, take a deep breath, count to 10. Why does that work? Well, as I'm sure one of you would have volunteered had we been in class right now, the reason that works is because it gives you, you know, just that 10 seconds to calm down, to allow, you know, your rational brain to come into play and to really think about, you know, why you're feeling the way that you're feeling, you know, why you're angry, why you're sad. To just take that 10 minutes, take that deep breath, and then, you know, don't prematurely act, don't jump to conclusions, don't say something that you can't take back. You know, one of the sayings that I often say, pun intended, it certainly was not something that I invented, it was something that I heard many times from one of my earliest employers, was, you know, words spoken you're a slave to, words unspoken you're the master of. And I think that that is particularly true, because you can't take back what you said. You can apologize for it, you can say, you know, I misunderstood or I was angry, but once those words are out there in the air, they never go away. And as I've said before in class so many times, words have power. Communication has power. And certainly right now. I'm noticing you're not shuffling your books and telling me it's time to shut up yet, but we're almost at the hour mark, and this is about the point at which we were in class. I would say that's it. So that's it. I will be in touch with you. I have posted a new discussion prompt for this week about, or 2 discussion prompts for this week, and I would ask that you complete those as you're able. In conclusion, I hope that you're all safe. I hope that you're all well. If there's any way that I can help you during this time, please feel free to reach out to me. Don't hesitate. Give me a call. You know, shoot me an email. I'm more on top of my email now than I have ever been before, and that's saying quite a bit if you've you know, communicated with me in the past before all of this took place. So again, take care of yourselves. I'll be doing a video on the material for Chapter 7 here in the very near future. Once I get that posted, I will notify you. And in the meantime, as I said, stay in touch. Have a great day.